Welcome to the lecture for Psych 310. In this lecture, we'll provide you with a course overview. We'll talk a little about the syllabus and what's expected of you, and then there'll be some information presented regarding defining abnormal behavior. So first, some things from the syllabus. So if you haven't already done so, you may want to print it out or pull it up alongside this screen, because I'll be talking about things directly from there. First of all, course objectives. Overall, what you should get out of this course. Lots of things. Obviously, information about abnormal psychology and psychopathology. I think the most important objective, at least in my mind, is the first one listed on the syllabus, and that's that you'll be able to generate appropriate questions to ask in order to differentiate between normal and abnormal behavior, between abnormal behavior and psychopathology. Okay? Because I can teach you the rules for where we currently draw the lines between normal and abnormal, between abnormal and psychopathology. But those rules are not set in stone. They change. So it's important for you to learn how to think about those things and how those decisions are made, and to think for yourself whether or not you agree with how those decisions are made. And that's really the biggest thing I want you to get out of this course, along with some other information related to psychopathology. Much of it should be very helpful to you if you plan on proceeding in the mental health field, and even if not, I think you'll find the course interesting and potentially useful in other areas of life, because most of us will come into contact with people that exhibit things that we typically define as abnormal behavior or as psychopathology. In terms of the mode of instruction, obviously this is a fully online course. Primarily, content will be delivered through lecture videos like this one, and then we'll have quizzes, and you have assignments that I'll give you feedback on. But we won't be using any of the chat functions or anything like that in Blackboard, because they haven't demonstrated sufficient reliability yet. Otherwise, we would have more of the interactive stuff. Your textbook is the Essentials of Abnormal Psychology, 6th edition by Drand and Barlow. You can get a digital version, I think cheaper than the hard print one. Some folks have asked about the older edition. They don't look strikingly different to me, the 5th edition and 6th edition. If you use the 5th edition, you may miss a few quiz questions here and there, but probably not so many that it wouldn't reduce your grade by a full letter grade, I would think, but hard for me to predict. So safest thing is to buy the new one, but if you're trying to save some money, you might be able to get by with the 5th edition and just attending closely to the lectures. In terms of contacting me, the best way to get hold of me is email me in Blackboard, and I'll try to get back to you within 24 hours as best I can. You can also call me, leave a message on my office phone. I'm typically there Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 9 to 2, and that phone number is listed on your syllabus. In terms of participation, this isn't a self-paced course, even though it is online and it is largely asynchronous. There are still several deadlines which are there to keep you from getting too far behind and trying to do everything at once at the end. So you can work ahead, assuming I've got all the quizzes posted and everything, but you can't work behind. You can't put stuff off. If you do, you'll end up losing points. The assignments, the first one, or set of assignments, would be the debate postings. And this is where there's going to be, in the discussion section of Blackboard, you'll see 5 separate discussion forums or threads that addresses a particular debate topic relevant to abnormal psychology. And you choose one of these forums to participate in over the course of the semester. And you're going to make 3 position postings, where you're going to post an argument, either pro or con, and you can switch. You can do 1 pro, 2 con, 2 pro, 1 con, whatever, or all pro, all con, up to you. But you basically make some arguments saying, okay, yeah, I think this is right, and here's why. Here's a reason that the pro position is right. But to get full credit, you not only have to have an argument supporting the pro, here's why this is the way it is. You must also cite a source that supports your position, preferably an empirical source. results of some study, and I'll post an example of what those postings look like. We'll give you a better idea. But you do 3 of those, and then 1 rebuttal posting where you're going to reply to somebody else's posting, where you will read their position posting, and then you will reply to that. For the rebuttal, you don't have to cite a source. You just say what you think may be flawed in their logic or their reasoning, or if they cite some source, you might critique the source and present some reason why their argument is weak or not applicable. Okay. One thing to note on the postings, to get full credit, it has to be an original posting. You can't just read somebody else's, what they said in their source, and say the same thing in the same source. If you do that, even if it's coincidental, you won't get credit. So find your own, then look at the others, make sure nobody else has already said that exact same thing in the exact same source, and then post it. Otherwise, you won't get credit. Okay, so the debate postings and the due dates for those are on the calendar at the end. And let's see, for example, flip to the calendar real quick. The first debate posting is due Friday, March 30th. Right? So we do at 11:59 p.m. just before midnight that Friday. And everything will be due just before midnight on the day that it's assigned to be due with the calendar. The defining normal essay, which again I said before that main thing I want you to get out of this class is thinking about how we define normal and abnormal. So for this essay, this brief paper, really, you're going to pick some particular aspect of psychopathology that we covered during the semester. Right? It could be obsessive thinking and OCD, the fear of becoming fat that's associated with anorexia nervosa, seeing things that other people don't see, right? Hallucinations that we associate with psychotic disorders. Right? So pick some aspect of psychopathology, and then answer the following questions in your essay, in your paper. 1, what does this look like in normal people? So, what does obsessive thinking look like in people that we consider normal? What's a normative amount, a normal amount of obsessive thinking? Right? And then 2, how is it different in people who we would label as exhibiting psychopathology? Okay, well, if you're doing it like this, then we say, okay, that's psychopathology. Right? And then 3rd, when would 2 people who exhibit the same amount or same level of this behavior, thought, emotion, process, whatever, be looked at differently? So might there be an example where 2 people obsess the same exact amount, they have the same amount of obsessive thinking, but in one instance, in one set of circumstances, if they're doing this thing, if this is part of their identity, whatever, oh, that's normal for them. But if it's not, okay, then it's abnormal. Okay, so think about that. It should be at least a page, can certainly be longer. And you will earn a higher grade if you cite sources to support your statements, but you're not required to do so for this particular assignment. It can just be your opinion. Then the Ask the Therapist assignment. This is one where I'll post a couple of client letters, kind of Dear Abby type stuff, where a client is asking for advice on some topic, and you'll need to write a response to one of the clients based on current empirical knowledge on the subject. And this means you'll need to cite the findings of a minimum of 3 empirical articles. An empirical article is one where somebody did an actual study. So it's not an opinion paper, it's not a theory paper, it's not a review paper where somebody talks about, okay, here are all these studies that have been done, and they're just talking about all the studies that have been done. It's a study. Here's a study that was done. Here are the results from that study. Okay, so you have to find an original empirical article. 3 of them to support the advice you're going to be giving. So you'll choose just one letter. There'll be more than one letter posted. You'll choose one to respond to, and you'll give the advice and say, okay, you should do this. And Brown and Suarez in 2002 found that blah blah blah. And because they found this, that's why I'm saying you should do this. Okay, so you have to justify your advice with research findings. Okay. And the best place to find these articles would be, in my opinion, the PsycInfo database. So you go to the library homepage, databases, and then PsycInfo under P. Go in there and search for articles. You're much more likely to find good, reliable, valid, peer-reviewed articles there than just Googling a topic, right? Using like Google Scholar or whatever other things you may use. Certainly don't go to Wikipedia. So scientific journals here, okay? And again, this should be at least a page in length, in addition to having a reference page. You're going to have several quizzes, a syllabus quiz and then a quiz over each of the chapters that you're assigned to read. They're open book, but not open friend. They're timed, typically an hour. Most of them will be 10 questions. I think the syllabus quiz is only 5. And you shouldn't need to watch the videos to complete the quizzes, but you may find it helpful to watch the videos before you do the quizzes, because there'll be a video for each chapter. And then the final exam will be at the end of the semester, obviously. It'll be comprehensive. It'll be a mixture of multiple choice and essay questions. And it'll be it'll require you to apply knowledge. It won't be like, what is the here's this definition. What word is this definition defining? It'll be more of, okay, if somebody's presenting these symptoms, which of the disorders we talked about would they most likely meet criteria for? Something like many things will be things like that. Okay, in terms of technical requirements, if you're able to see this video, you probably have figured a lot of this out already. But one thing that I always tell people, when you're taking quizzes, and especially when you take the final exam, use a hardwired computer, not a laptop that's relying on a router or your your smartphone. And best thing, I think, if you can take especially the final exam, go up to the computer lab if you can. And take it there, because you're much less likely to get kicked out. I've had students get kicked out in the middle of an exam and then they can't get back in, and that's a problem. For tech support, there's a support portal, the TAMU CT Blackboard support that you can access 24 hours a day. It's linked off our Blackboard site. Academic integrity basically is about doing your own work and giving people credit for ideas. So doing your own work, not cheating on exams and quizzes, not submitting a paper in this class that you've written for some other class, right, unless you get my approval and the other professor's approval. It's the only time you can do anything like that. When you're citing research articles in your papers, like Ask the Therapist, you always give appropriate credit to, okay, this idea came from here, here's the authors of that study, kind of thing. In violation of these policies, violation of the academic integrity policy will result in failing the course and then potentially other sanctions from student services. You can also look at syllabus information about other support services, including disability support, library services, UniLert, tutoring, all that stuff. If you're going to drop, make sure you take care of the paperwork for that, because I don't even know what happens until it's been processed. You have the grade breakdown there, the percentage of what each thing is worth. And now that we switched to the new Blackboard, I haven't yet figured out exactly how to use the grading system yet. So, like the debate postings, when you do it, it'll be graded out of 100%, and then you'll have to figure, okay, if you got a 90, and then on all of your debate postings together, right, 90 average, you say, okay, well, it's worth 20%, so how many of those 20 percentage points did I get? When you go 90% times 20 is 18, right? 18 out of 20 points. You have to do that yourself, because I can't figure out how to get Blackboard to do that for you yet. If you turn in stuff late, you lose a letter grade, or about 10% for every day that something is late. But up to, I didn't put on the syllabus, but it only goes up to 50%. After 5 days, even if you turn it in 3 weeks late, you can still earn 50% on the quiz or assignment, because I still want you to turn stuff in. Okay. work policy, yeah. And then the last thing, the course calendar, probably the most important thing. You want to print that out probably and put it beside your computer. Has whenever the video lectures will be available, and then when things are due on the right-hand column. And again, things will be due 11:59, just before midnight on the day that they're assigned. Hopefully everything is clear. If you have any questions, let me know. Okay, so now let's move on to a brief discussion about how abnormal behavior is defined. Okay, first, I want you to try to think of examples. When you hear the term abnormal behavior, what do you think of? What is something that you would consider abnormal behavior? Okay, now that you've kind of thought about a couple of things, I'll just kind of tell you again the definition from your textbook of what constitutes abnormal behavior. According to Duran and Barlow, it's actions that are unexpected and often evaluated negatively because they differ from typical or usual behavior. Right, so unexpected, negatively evaluated, and atypical. Okay. So thinking about that definition, are the things you thought of in your examples, do they meet that those criteria? Are they actions? Were they things that are unexpected? Do you kind of see them negatively? And are they different than what typical behavior is? Okay. Now I want you to think about, okay, so that definition, what does it mean? Let's take it piece by piece. It talks about their actions that are unexpected. Well, who sets the expectations? Unexpected by who? You know, if a woman decides to work full-time rather than to stay home and raise children, is this abnormal behavior? You know, I mean, this may violate expectations of some people. So this question hopefully points out to you that context is supremely important in defining abnormal behavior. Right? What's abnormal to me may not be abnormal to you, and that's a hugely important concept for this entire course. Right? The importance of context in defining abnormal behavior. And then the other thing was, the second part of this thing was, it's often negatively evaluated. Why? Why is the evaluation negative? Probably because of the first part, the unexpected, right? Behaviors that are unexpected make people seem unpredictable, maybe even mysterious, and this makes us uncomfortable, right? We don't like not knowing what somebody's going to do or why they're doing what they're doing, right? Because if we don't know what they're doing or why they're doing it, they might do something that hurts us, hurt somebody we love, or embarrass us. Right? We like predictability, and people vary with how much they need predictability. Right? It's an individual difference, but by and large, most people prefer some level of predictability and are uncomfortable with certain levels of unpredictability, and that's probably a big reason why there's that kind of negative evaluative component. And the last part was differs from typical behavior. Well, hopefully the question that pops in your head at this point is, well, what's typical behavior? You know, what's normal? Well, it's what most people do. Well, how many people is most people? I don't know. That's a good question. And beyond that, how far from typical can you get and still be normal? So, you think about when you're walking down the street, if you're not facing forwards, but instead you're facing backwards or even facing sideways, that's kind of abnormal, right? You deviated from a norm, a pretty clear norm, and most people say, oh, that's abnormal. Now, if somebody asks, well, what kind of toothpaste do you use? What's the normal answer? What's the typical answer? I don't know, Crest, Colgate? I don't know. So, the point of this is that typical behavior, again, there's some context here. Some norms are more well defined than others, right? For some behaviors, we have clear expectations, and there's a clear understanding, shared understanding of what constitutes typical behavior. And then for other behaviors, you have more latitude for deviating from the norm. Okay. So even understanding abnormal behavior, which may seem pretty clear, oh yeah, I know what it is if I see it, maybe it's not so clear. It's maybe a little harder to track down than you maybe first assumed. Well, the other thing that we talk about that isn't the same thing as abnormal behavior, but is related, would be psychological disorders. And what I'm going to present here is the definition of a psychological disorder that's included in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 4th edition text revision, written by the American Psychiatric Association. So, a psychological disorder is a behavioral or psychological syndrome or pattern. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, compared to the definition of abnormal behavior, where it was actions, well, this is a behavioral psychological syndrome or pattern. So when we have something like psychological pattern, then that tells us, well, it can be more than just actions, right? It can be, because psychological has to do with actions or behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. So thoughts, behaviors, feelings, and some syndrome of those things, or some pattern. So not just one thing. So one single behavior, one single thought, not sufficient to constitute a psychological disorder. Now let's consider for a second a hypothetical disorder, one that doesn't currently exist in the DSM, to help us think about this definition a bit further. Something that I've called teenager syndrome. So teenager syndrome, could meet the definition of psychological disorder, because I can think of multiple behaviors, thoughts, and feelings that they're a syndrome, they're a pattern, they occur in more than one individual, right? So this kind of repetitive nature. I see the same constellation of behaviors associated with this syndrome. Some examples include spends excessive amounts of time engaged in nonverbal communication while ignoring important external stimuli. That would be when they're texting when you're trying to tell them it's time for dinner. There might be kind of a cognition, overly concerned with how they are perceived by others. Okay. And then kind of affectively, it's common to see pronounced mood reactivity, such that they can seem happy and fine, and you say the wrong thing, and suddenly they're very angry. They react strongly with their emotions to stimuli. Okay. So I've got all these different thoughts, feelings, behaviors. It happens in more than one individual, such that I see that it's a pattern. Okay, so maybe this is a disorder. Okay. The next component to the definition, so it's this pattern of behaviors, thoughts, feelings that's clinically significant. And this is a seemingly innocuous phrase, right? Well, yeah, okay, that sounds good, clinically significant. But this is a very important little piece of the definition. What clinically significant means is that some clinician decides if it's significant. Some clinician decides if it's a disorder, right? This is the part of the definition that gives some people the power to label other people. Right? If you think your mother-in-law is narcissistic, you can't say, oh, well, she has narcissistic personality disorder. Well, I mean, you could say that, but it wouldn't really mean anything. Now, if you were a licensed mental health care provider treating her, which would be unethical for some other reasons, and you said that, then that would have some impact, right? That would be part of her medical record and would have an impact on certain things. So clinically significant is an important part of this definition. Some people are empowered to make the decision of whether or not, given all the other aspects of the definition, okay, given all this stuff, based on my expertise, does this person meet criteria or not? Okay. Another big piece. It's a manifestation of a behavioral, biological, or psychological dysfunction. And it probably could just put manifestation of a psychological dysfunction, but to keep the different camps happy who argue about whether we should just focus on behavior or we should just focus on biology, you put everything in there together. But this basically is saying that something is not functioning the way it should. Right? And again, notice there's an assumption inherent here that there is a correct way to be or for things to function. Right? So with our teenager syndrome, one thing you may see is friends suggest you jump off a bridge, and you do so despite being aware of the risks involved. Well, this clearly is indicative of a dysfunction in impulse regulation. Right? So a normal person who's functioning appropriately would have the impulse to jump, but would regulate that impulse and not jump. Right? So there's something wrong with some part of the way you're thinking, feeling, or behaving. It's not the right way. And who determines the right way? Probably a clinician. Okay, but it's so there's a dysfunction, and it's associated with distress, disability, excuse me, or risk of suffering. Okay. So if you have, if you meet the other criteria for disorder, let's say you hear voices, but it doesn't bother you, it doesn't really get in the way of anything you want to do, and you're not in risk of getting hurt, then you don't have a disorder. Even if you have a symptom, most people would say, oh wow, yeah, that sounds like you have a disorder. If it's not causing problems and doesn't bother you, not a disorder. But for each of these, hopefully you'll kind of stop and think, well, what do they mean by that? So associated with distress, how much distress does it need to be to meet criteria for this? Well, significant distress. What the DSM says. Well, what's significant distress? Well, probably a clinician decides that as well. But so with our teenager syndrome, maybe you got unfriended on Facebook and locked yourself in your room for supper. Is that clinically significant distress? Is that enough to make this a disorder? Maybe. And even disability, that seems straightforward, but again, disability unable to do what? That assumes there are certain things that people should do or should be able to do. Right? So again, with the teenager syndrome, due to lack of foresight, the teenagers are unable to manage a small company. Right? That's a disability. They should be able to do that, I would think. But they can't because they have the teenager syndrome. So what should people be able to do? And generally we think of this being, well, you should be able to function at an average level in school, work, and relationships. But again, not everybody can be average, but we assume that everybody can. Okay, so distress, disability, or risk of suffering. Well, how much suffering? What type of suffering? For our teenager syndrome, because of their desire for romantic attachments paired with their impulsivity, they may end up trying to engage another teenager in a romantic rendezvous, asking somebody on a date, which puts them at risk for rejection and emotional suffering. So again, this disorder of being a teenager is associated with a risk of suffering. Clearly these people need help. So hopefully these things are getting you to think about how this isn't going to be straightforward this semester. Right? There are some very important and difficult questions about how to define abnormal behavior and how to define psychological disorders. Now this next one is another important piece. All this other stuff, this dysfunction and this syndrome, all these problems you're having, are not an expectable and culturally sanctioned reaction to an event. So if someone you love very much dies, and you feel depressed, and you cry, and you don't eat, you have a hard time concentrating, all symptoms of major depressive disorder, we don't diagnose you with major depressive disorder, because it's an expectable reaction to an event. And for us in the United States, it's a culturally sanctioned event for the most part, and there are some exceptions to that. In other cultures, that may not be culturally sanctioned. And there may be some cultures where you can grieve for a long time, for years, and that's culturally sanctioned, and it's fine. In America, it's not. You got about 6 months to be grieving, and after that, we say, okay, it's no longer grief. Now it probably is depression, right? Because we have these kind of unwritten cultural rules about how long you can grieve, how upset you can be. But again, so for some things, people say, okay, well, that's expectable. If you get mugged, it's expectable to be shook up, right? To be nervous and agitated for a while. If those symptoms persist, then we think, okay, well, maybe this is now a disorder, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder, maybe. So and then this last one is a little screwy. Conflicts with society don't count as psychological disorders, unless of course they do. And this is in here. The first part, that conflicts with society don't constitute disorders because of past abuses of psychiatry, in terms of imprisoning people, political dissidents. You think that women should have the right to vote? Well, you're clearly mentally ill and need to be locked up and protected from yourself, because only a crazy person would think that. Right? So people who disagreed with some prevailing view were often labeled with a disorder, and that way they could be confined without due process, unfortunately. So that's the reason that part is in here, to kind of keep that from happening anymore as much as possible. But then the unless it is part is, well, yeah, but sometimes you can be kind of a political dissident and still have a disorder, and that can be part of your disorder. So if you ever watch that whale wars, right? Those people that go out on the little boats and they chase the big boats of the whalers, and they shoot them with water cannons, and the whalers shoot back with like guns and stuff. Very dangerous thing. And you might think, well, that seems to pose risk of suffering. That there might be some sort of psychological disorder associated with that, wanting to do that. But this criteria would say, no, it's not, unless it is. And the one example of where unless it is may be true is, well, let's say someone had a delusion that they were a whale. Right? So I believe I'm a whale, and therefore I must go protect my kin from these harpoonists. In that case, the behavior is part of the delusion, and it is a disorder. But so just because you're fighting whalers doesn't mean you have a disorder, but you still might have a disorder. Hopefully that's not too confusing. Okay, so we've talked about abnormal behavior. We've talked about psychological disorders, one after the other. So now let's look at them at the kind of the same time. How are they the same? How are they different? Well, in a nutshell, most disorders involve abnormal behavior, but not all abnormal behavior constitutes a disorder. Right? And to some degree, it's a matter of thinking about it being on a spectrum, where as a behavior becomes more abnormal, deviates more from a norm, more likely to be a disorder. So how deviant it is, how atypical it is, that's one consideration. But then the other major considerations are the degree to which it causes distress and the degree to which it causes impairment. And so deviation from a norm, distress, and impairment. When those things are present, it's much more likely to constitute something we refer to as a psychological disorder. Which again, a disorder isn't a thing, it's just a label we apply to some collection of behavior as we're trying to understand it and usually treat it. Now, thinking back to what we talked about originally about the definition of abnormal behavior, we talked about it's about the violation of expectations. And whose expectations? Well, for a psychological disorder, it's clinicians' expectations that you're violating. They're the ones that decide if your behavior is atypical, is not in keeping with expectations. In terms of the negative evaluation, Some disorders have kind of a more negative connotation to them than others. And we'll see that over the course of the semester. I won't kind of talk too much about it now, but there is some stigma attached to having a disorder, but some disorders are more stigmatizing than others. And then lastly, in terms of the norms, what's normal in terms of the symptoms in psychological disorders? Who determines that? Well, really two branches. One would be the clinicians, there's clinical opinion, and then empirical researchers, right? So there are some data on how anxious people are and how often people cry, and that influences to some degree diagnostic criteria, but to a pretty substantial degree as well, clinical opinion weighs in there too, in terms of determining how sad is it okay to be sad. It's not simply a matter of looking at the data. Rather, clinicians look at the data, and they also use their own expertise and experience to decide what normal is. A couple of the terms that you'll see over the course of the semester I wanted to touch on now. One will be psychopathology, which is the study of psychological disorders. It also sometimes used just as a broad term to refer to the presence of aspects of disorders. Like somebody exhibits, high levels of psychopathology, they're exhibiting lots of symptoms of some disorders. Other terms you may hear or read: mental disorder, sometimes used interchangeably with psychological disorder, and really the same thing, just a different way of saying it, putting the emphasis on the mental aspects as opposed to the behavioral aspects. And this has to do with kind of philosophical differences in the field that you don't need to worry about right now. Another term, mental illness, which some say, oh, well, yeah, mental illness, psychological disorder, same thing. Yes and no. They're used to refer to the same thing, but they reflect very different perspectives. When you use the term mental illness, that implies this kind of medical model that this collection of behaviors is an illness, right, and follows this kind of disease model, right, which suggests that it could be contagious, but it also suggests that it can be cured, right, and that there's something wrong, or something pathological about this person that needs to be fixed. Okay. Another term that we'll talk even more about later would be insanity, which is not a clinical term. That's a legal term. Clinicians don't use the term insanity or insane. That's for lawyers and judges. And the last term I just want to touch on would be etiology, because I'll talk about it a lot. And etiology has to do with the study of origins. So I'm talking about the etiology of a client's depression. Why are they depressed? Where did it come from? What's the cause of it? Okay. And then some more terms related to who experiences abnormal behavior. Epidemiology, and one reason I have this in here is just to make sure you understand it's not the same thing as etiology. So etiology is the study of origins. Epidemiology is the study of the occurrence, course, and transmission of diseases. Right? Originally epidemics, but now really all diseases and disorders. If you're studying how many people have them, geographically how they're distributed, that's epidemiology. Right? One thing that epidemiologists look at would be incidence and prevalence. Incidence, that's the number of new cases in a given time period. So when you talk about the incidence, you have to have some context. So the 1-year incidence, the 2-year incidence, whatever. So the 1-year incidence of OCD, well, that's how many people were diagnosed with OCD in the past year. Right? Versus prevalence, which is the total number of cases at some point in time. Right? So the prevalence of OCD today is how many people meet criteria for obsessive compulsive disorder today. Another term you'll see related to this would be comorbidity, and this is the presence of 2 or more disorders or diseases at the same time. So if you have anxiety and comorbid depression, it means you have anxiety and depression. In terms of who experiences abnormal behavior, really a large study done years ago now, the epidemiologic catchment area study, found that 32% of the population said at one point in their lives they had met criteria for a psychological disorder. This was using a certain set of criteria. It was slightly less if there was dysfunction or disability involved, where they missed work, kind of thing, 20%. But still a pretty good chunk of the population meeting criteria for some disorder. So a lot of people meet criteria at some point in their lives for something in the DSM. And it's what, 32%? But I would predict that 99% of you will diagnose yourselves or someone you know with a disorder this summer. And that's not because I think you all have disorders or people you know have disorders. It's because I think these disorders that we're studying aren't these kind of rare maladies that only affect some people. You know, these disorders are just aspects of the human condition that some people struggle with more than others. So it's really not surprising that you'll see yourself or someone you love reflected in the descriptions. Doesn't mean they have the disorder, doesn't mean they meet criteria, but the experiences are part of the human experience, not just disordered experience. It's not typically not qualitatively different. It's more often quantitatively different, right? With major depressive disorder, a lot of people have times when they feel sad. They have problems concentrating. They have times when they're not hungry. If you have all of that at once for a long enough time, you might meet criteria for major depressive disorder. But again, that's quantitative difference, not qualitative. Over the course of the semester, we'll also see that there are gender differences in the diagnostic rates of disorders. And some of that may be because men and women express pathology at different levels. And some of it is differences in terms of, even if they might be the same in terms of expression, one might be diagnosed more than the other due to kind of societal pressures to suppress or express certain symptoms. We'll also address cultural differences in terms of the diagnostic rates of disorders. And then we'll also touch on disease burden, which this is a term that talks about the impact of a disorder or disease beyond just that you have it, right? So having major depressive disorder, there's a measurable disease burden. It's usually at a kind of a population level. You know, what's the financial impact? What's the impact on morbidity, mortality, on you know, their health, on how likely they are to die, on their quality of life, things like that. Okay, so that's about it for now.